Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw short white fur in graphite. Now the first thing that I like to do is really focus on a base layer. Now this is the foundation for our details, so I just want to be making sure to hint at a softness. I don't want any harsh start and stop points, and here all I'm doing is indicating at my main lights and darks. Now depending on what we're drawing, graphite powder is not able to go as dark as what we would potentially need, so that's where of course we would go over the top with our graphite pencils. However, for something like this where the fur is that much lighter, we do need to be careful not to make that base layer too dark. Now for this tutorial I didn't really want to focus heavily on the ear section. I wanted this study to focus more on the soft white fur on the top of the head. But here on the Patreon real-time tutorial, I am still showing how to capture those white longer hairs in the centre of the ears. Now my biggest tip when drawing the insides of cat ears is do make sure that that base layer is dark enough. If it's not dark enough, these lighter highlights, these longer hairs that I'm currently adding will not show up. So that's a good indication if any time the erasers are not giving the highlight that you would want. There are a couple of reasons for that, but one of the main causes is that the base layer isn't quite dark enough. Now the other cause is that the graphite hasn't been applied in the right way. Now I speak about this a lot in other tutorials where I'm using more of my graphite pencils. But if the graphite is being applied too heavy-handed, or we are burnishing, which is where we are flattening the tooth of the paper by using excessive pressure, then those erasers are going to have a much harder job to lift that graphite off the surface. Now this is something that I focus thoroughly in all of my real-time step-by-step tutorials on Patreon, so if you would like to follow along to this or any of my other real-time lessons, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. So as I start to work on the main section of fur, this is where I'm using my graphite powder again to map in the very subtle shades, those mid-tones, but it's always making sure not to go too dark. Now the one thing that I want to mention as well is white fur is never truly white. Unless you've got a reference photo that's overexposed, those sections would look really bright. But for something like this, there is still going to have to be a layer of graphite on that paper, even for those brighter sections. But of course, as I said, the exception would be if you're working from a reference photo that is overexposed and you want to replicate that bright light source in your drawing, then you might want to allow the white of the paper to show through. But for something like this, I've got a graphite layer over the entire section, and then I can come back in with my erasers and pull in my highlights. Now the other thing that I'd like to mention as well is the way that I approach white fur is very different from reference photo to reference photo. So here, throughout this study, I actually very rarely used a graphite pencil at all. There was only one moment where I was just trying to darken up the centre of the ears that I used my graphite pencils. However, if I was drawing another white fur with different lighting, then that may require use of more of my pencils, which of course would alter the layering process. But for something like this, I was really focusing on applying that graphite with that graphite powder. So what I'm going to be doing here is using a graphite pencil just to show that you can darken up in between your highlights if you want to, but I didn't continue with this method. I preferred to darken it with my graphite powder. But I just wanted to show my Patreon members a couple of different options because there are many different ways to get to the same end. Now I have a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. I'll pop that in the description below if it's of interest. But there I talk about three main things: the fur length, the fur thickness, and fur direction. Now all of these things are going to help to build up that three-dimensional shape of the animal that we're drawing. You can really see here how I'm focusing on how the fur curves in many different directions. It's subtle, but it is there. There are no straight lines at all. Now the fur direction, it follows that underlying bone and muscular structure. So in order to replicate that three-dimensional look, the fur direction is really going to help to follow the contours of the face. So if we don't replicate that properly, then that animal is not going to resemble that reference photo and that person's pet as it should. Now the fur length is determined by how long that pencil or eraser is in contact with the surface for. So the longer that pencil is in contact, obviously the longer those details are going to be, but this is something that's very important, just as much as the fur direction. If we start to lengthen our pencil strokes, then that's going to make that fur look longer and therefore of course not resemble that animal as it should. So that's also something that's so important. Now the fur thickness is determined by a couple of different factors, including how sharp your pencil is, how much pressure you're applying to the pencil, and even how you're holding or moving that pencil can influence many different pencil strokes. So this again is something that I focus thoroughly in my real-time step-by-step tutorials on Patreon. Now because my Patreon tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, every single process is explained in the moment, so I'm able to really cover that thoroughly. And something I do speak about in that real-time version is how I like to break everything up into smaller sections. Now when I work on studies like this, it's a little different. I do usually work in a little bit more of a larger area. However, if I was working on a full portrait, I like to get an ear completed. Then I'll work on the top of the head and then the other ear and so on. It just means then that I'm not looking at anything that's too large and therefore I'm less likely to become overwhelmed. If you're looking at your reference photo and thinking, I'm not quite sure where to start, that's a good indication that you're focusing on too much of a larger area. Scale that down to 1 or 2 inches and you'll find that you'll work far more effectively and efficiently. Now of course, if your preference is to work in whole individual solid layers and that works for you, then that's absolutely fine. But if you do find yourself getting stuck, then it is a good idea to break it up into smaller sections. Now as I work more on this fur, you can really see how all of these details that I'm adding are very subtle, and this is really important when working on an animal that's as light coated as this. Now because white fur is never truly white, you can see that I keep coming back in here with my paper blending stumps to reinforce more of those darker tones. They are subtle and they look soft, but they're there. This means then that when I come back in and pull in my highlights, they're going to be more visible because I've made sure that the clumps of shadows underneath are dark enough. Now if I'd have come in here with really dark graphite powder, I'd have had to work really hard with the erasers in order to lift that up off the paper. Now what can happen there is you can end up actually with fur that looks wiry or coarse because you've actually got too much contrast. Now this is something that you very rarely hear me say. I often say about how you want to darken your darks and lighten your highlights, but for something like this, if the base layers are too dark, the fur will look wiry. So that is something that is really important to pay attention to. Now one big tip, if you're using an eraser as much as I am here, you can see that you get those little bits of eraser shavings stuck onto the paper. It's a really good idea to take a brush and just wipe those off, because if you accidentally push those into the paper, they can be really difficult to then remove later on. So it's always worth just keeping that area nice and clean. And I use a fan brush, a clean fan brush, and I use that just to wipe that across the top. You see it frequently here, and that therefore just means that I am preventing any of those little bits of eraser shavings or bits of graphite from being stuck to the paper. Now what I wanted to do for this section of the real-time tutorial is cover in the top section, make that nice and dark, and then show how to add in these little highlights, those whiter hairs over the background. Now this is something that I think could potentially make the portrait look like a sticker. So if we don't get these details right and they're not as fine as what we've got here, it can end up looking like the subject's been cut out and just stuck onto the paper. So it's really important to make sure that the technique used for these little hairs are just as delicate as the layering process and techniques that we've used throughout. So you can see that those hairs there, they look really fine. They're thinner at the ends and they're thicker at the base. So using the right technique in order to achieve that with the eraser can really help to add that extra level of realism to the portrait. So for the very last layer here, what I'm doing is I'm coming back in with my graphite pencil and darkening up in between some of my highlights. Now this is needed. This is one of those stages where I'm really happy with what I'd created, how light the fur was, how soft the fur was, but I did feel that some areas needed to have a higher contrast. So I need to come in and darken up some of those areas for the underlayers. Now because I was really happy with where it was at this stage, I didn't want to come back in with my graphite powder and darken up the area completely. So therefore I decided to come back in with those graphite pencils and just darken a few areas. Once I was happy with that, I could then add those little whiskers on the tops of the eyebrows. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, I'd be very, very grateful. It really does help my channel. And I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week. So if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in drawing along to the real-time version of this white fur study, then that is available now on my Patreon channel. And I do have a list of all tutorials that are available on my Patreon listed on my website, so you get an idea of what's there before you join. Now the wonderful thing about Patreon is it's really flexible. You can stay for as long as you like or you can cancel at any time. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.